I've been sick for like a few days now. I'm like well enough to speak at a camera for an hour straight, sort of. Um, but if my voice sounds a little weird, that's why. Bela Lugosi's 1933 classic Dracula is a masterpiece of gothic horror. The film is dripping in a pitch black atmosphere. I especially love the portrayal of Dracula's castle in Transylvania. From the outside, we see a meticulously painted view of the structure, standing jagged and inky against the night sky. The castle's interior reeks of aristocracy in decline. A once proud estate that housed members of the wealthy elite, now caked in dust, full of broken windows and impossibly large spider webs. The story of the film is a classic. Dracula and his deranged henchman Renfield voyage to England and take up residence in a disused abbey. Once there, Dracula wastes no time ingratiating himself into the local socialite scene. While attending a play, he meets Dr. Seward, the proprietor of a sanitarium that neighbors his new property, along with his daughter, Mina, her fiancé, and a family friend, Lucy. After secretly feeding on the blood of the two women, killing Lucy, Dracula is exposed by the iconic Dr. Van Helsing, who eventually saves the day by finding the Count's secret resting place and driving a stake through his heart just in time to save the life and the eternal soul of Mina. And it's fantastic. It's dark and gothic and theatrical and campy and ultimately just a really fun watch. But what is Dracula about? Like, beyond the literal events of the story, what is the film trying to tell us? What does it say about us and about our fears? And I think I have a pretty straightforward answer to that. And it's not a unique or new insight by any means. Dracula, as a piece of art, represents, among other things, societal anxieties around female sexuality. This might sound like a bit of a stretch at first, but I think when one looks a little deeper into the events of the film, it becomes pretty obvious.
Wait.
Firstly, it's important to establish the innate sexuality in the film's portrayal of vampirism. Dracula's attacks in the film are strangely intimate. He preys exclusively on young, beautiful women, often in their bedrooms or on lonely street corners. And the bite itself is, to the viewer, indistinguishable from a kiss on the neck. In addition to this, his victims are often seen to be initially fearful, but to ultimately submit fully to the dominant force of the vampire. They almost seem to like it. In Dracula, the film stokes ambiguity as to how much of this submission is due to Dracula's supernatural mind control powers, and how much of it is due to some kind of real, organic sexual attraction on the women's part. And I don't think it's a stretch to suggest that a film made in 1933, based on a novel written in 1897, might position this kind of open expression of female sexuality as something that the viewer should be fearful of. I want to explore how Dracula puts a lot of narrative emphasis on the sexual character of its two female characters. Mina and Lucy are suggested to be dissimilar in their approaches to sexuality. Mina is reserved, proper, and loyal to her fiancé, whereas Lucy is suggested to be more open and liberal in her sexuality. After the two meet Dracula for the first time, Lucy tells Mina that she finds him interesting. Mina, on the other hand, finds him strange and expresses that she is content being with someone more normal. Throughout the film, we get the feeling that it wants us to know that Lucy is less pure, and therefore more vulnerable to corruption than Mina. As the events of the movie play out, we see these differing character traits influence how the two women respond to Dracula's supernatural allure. Lucy falls to Dracula's charms almost immediately, and is soon transformed into a vampire herself. Her purity is literally eternally tarnished. She is given the perverse gift of immortality, along with a twisted, deviant lust for blood. And because of the way the film has positioned Lucy up until this point, we are to understand her transformation as an unleashing of her most carnal and sinful appetites, rather than as a transformation into something she's not. To put it more simply, I believe her transition is meant to be read as her giving in to temptations that, to some degree, were already present within her. Temptations specifically to abandon chastity, to instead be promiscuous and sexually aggressive. Later in the film, we see Dracula attempt to employ his mind control powers on Mina. It eventually works, more or less, but unlike Lucy, Mina is shown to engage in a valiant battle of wills with the vampire. And because of this, she is able to impede Dracula's abduction of her just long enough that Van Helsing is able to find and kill the vampire before Mina can be fully transformed. Mina, for her chastity, for her sexual integrity, is saved. And this is all fairly standard for early vampire fiction. The vampire stands as a projection of fears around deviant sexuality and/or pathogen. In Dracula, the vampire is not so much a symbol of an external threat as he is an example of a perceived internal one, the threat of promiscuity and sexual degeneracy, particularly that of women and particularly from the perspective of men. I mean, can you think of anything scarier than your GF falling prey to a sexy vampire? And maybe even liking it? Now I want to talk about another film. A film that uses the vampire in quite a different way. I'm talking about George A. Romero's Martin. It is a beautiful, pensive deconstruction of the archetypal vampire. The film is about a young man, Martin, who is maybe a vampire. He sexually preys upon women and drinks their blood. He also adamantly claims to be 84, despite appearing to be a teenager. But unlike Dracula, Martin has no obvious supernatural abilities. He does not possess mind control powers, he has no fangs, he cannot shapeshift, and he doesn't burst into flames in the sun. His thirst for blood and the sexual connotation of it are really the only concrete similarities between Martin and a traditional vampire. At its core, what sets Martin apart from the average piece of vampire fiction is the way it holds a mirror to the vampire itself, rather than to the vampire's victims. In the film, Romero is essentially asking the audience this: what happens when we strip the vampire of its mysticism? Without its magic, what are we left with? And like with Dracula, I think we receive a pretty straightforward answer to this question. Without its irresistible allure, without its mind control, without its jagged castles and bat wings, the vampire is a psychosexual mess, a deeply disturbed predator. Or, as the film puts it, a freak asshole. That line is delivered by Martin's first victim in the film. She's a young woman who happens to be taking the same train as Martin. When we first meet him, Martin appears to us to be a timid young man. A bit pale maybe, a bit disheveled too, but ultimately and uncomfortably human. This impression makes our initial encounter with Martin all the more disconcerting. We see Martin in a small bathroom on the train pull out a small bundle of what appear to be medical tools. We watch him fill a syringe with the contents of a small vial. Then, in the woman's private room on the train, Martin attacks her. They fight awkwardly on the ground, and in the struggle, Martin sticks the woman with the syringe. He frantically begs her to be quiet and assures her that she'll just fall asleep, that she won't be harmed, a line that he repeats to most of his victims throughout the film. Once she's unconscious, Martin engages in a perverse imitation of sex with the woman, lying naked next to her, holding her wrist over his head and cutting into her wrist with a razor blade. We watch as her blood spills onto him before he puts his mouth to the wound and drinks. So, I'd like to briefly zero in on a couple specific points in this initial scene. Firstly, we're immediately shown that Martin is not the sexy, dominant, master manipulator that we saw in Dracula. Martin did not employ some kind of vampiric mind control on her, nor did he stealthily creep to her bedside, and his blood drinking is not reminiscent of an intimate kiss. Rather, it is an act of frantic, disorganized violence, which is put on full display to the audience. I also want to point out the instruments that Martin uses in this attack. That intimate vampire's kiss that we see in other vampire movies is made possible by their fangs, designed specifically for puncturing the necks of their victims. In lieu of the traditional vampire's mind control, Martin instead injects his victims with a sedative. The syringes that litter this film serve as Martin's cold, metallic substitute for Dracula's supernatural influence. And strikingly, these drugged needles are often shown held between Martin's teeth. And I think it's also very important to point out that these injections are not as satisfying or empowering to Martin as the idea of total mental control over another person is. See, the traditional vampire has the ability to will into being the consent and submission of his victims, whereas Martin's sedative injections do not allow him to simulate the same kind of human connection with his victims. Despite the control offered by the sedatives, he will still always be at a distance from them. I'm gonna go more into this later, as it's a theme that's further developed throughout the film. But suffice it to say, this initial scene is an uncomfortable subversion of the traditional vampire story, and a powerful precedent for what kind of vampire story this will be. This vampire, Martin, appears way more analogous to deviant male sexual fantasy than it is a projection of repressed female sexuality. It's as if Romero watched a film like Dracula and asked himself, why should we be so concerned with the sexual character of these women when the vampire itself is such a sexually disturbed mess, ripe for examination? Shortly after this first attack, we find out that Martin is on this train because he is moving to Pittsburgh to live with his cousin, Tatakuda, an old man who is very concerned with Martin's vampirism. He is very old-fashioned and believes deeply in the old world lore surrounding vampires. We see him brandishing crucifixes at Martin and hanging garlic from his bedroom door. He truly, fully believes in the existence of the traditional, mystical vampire. We eventually learn that Martin is a ward of sorts to Tatakuda due to family tradition. In light of their family shame, the family's non-vampiric members must be, at times, responsible for watching over Martin and for making sure that he does not harm others. We learn that Tatakuta is the only character that really believes in this. His granddaughter, who also lives with him, finds it absurd and considers Martin to be nothing more than a disturbed kid. The film is constantly playing with this old world, new world dichotomy, with Tatakuta standing as the stubborn sole believer in the old ways. Martin, interestingly, also takes issue with this sort of folksy old-world magic being ascribed to his vampirism. He does believe himself to be a vampire, but has a different idea of what that means. In one scene early in the film, Martin storms down the stairs after Tatakuta, who escapes into his room and slams the door shut. Martin, undeterred by the wreath of garlic on the door, forces his way into the room to find Tatakuta cowering, crucifix in hand. In an effort to prove his point to the old man, Martin takes a bite out of a bulb of garlic. The scene is intercut with what appears to be a flashback, in which Martin states, "There isn't any magic! It's just a sickness." And here, we get a window into Martin's perspective on his own condition. He believes his vampirism to be an affliction. To Martin, his condition is something material, scientific, and coldly clinical. It is not mysterious or magical. It lacks that kind of romanticism. It is, to him, nothing more than a deeply socially alienating disease. To that point, I'd like to say that this film is very concerned with intimacy, both sexual and otherwise, and how starved Martin is for it. And this piece of subtext in the film is a real source of ambiguity, which I find myself dwelling on while watching Martin. The film juxtaposes Martin's hunger for blood with his hunger for intimacy. As Martin himself so strikingly puts it, he would like to have sex with someone who is awake, and at one point says that he would like to do it without the blood part. And I find myself wondering just how much of his appetite is a result of real biological dependence on blood, and how much is just a young man confused by his family's infatuation with old world folklore, using that folklore as a framework for understanding and acting upon his sexual frustration. I think the film is asking us, what is the meaningful difference between this distinctly unmagical, socially stunted, sexually frustrated vampire and any given unmagical, socially stunted, sexually frustrated predator? And ultimately, there's not much difference. Either way, we're left with a cold, desperate, and unnervingly personal portrait of loneliness, of predation, of deep, dark sexual hang-ups. I think it's important to emphasize that part about this being an unnervingly personal text. Standing parallel to the film's narrative themes of intimacy is the fact that the film itself is a deeply intimate character study. We, at all times, feel disconcertingly close to Martin. The film encourages us to relate to him, to feel sympathetic toward him, but then forces us to see, with the same level of closeness, the acts of horrific violence that he commits. To build off of this point, I'd like to point out that this film does not go to great lengths to convince you of Martin's badness. Rather, like Martin himself, the film is clinical, realistic in its portrayal of Martin's acts of deviance and violence. But it is also an uncomfortably close portrayal, verging on documentary. Romero trusts us to understand Martin's badness, and yet, he challenges us not to conceptualize him as a one-dimensional monster. No, despite the violence, despite his perverse appetites, Romero forces us to confront the uncomfortable fact that Martin is not the easily understood evil that we see in a film like Dracula. Martin is, again, uncomfortably human. I'd like to zero in on a scene that I think exemplifies what I'm trying to get at here. About halfway through the film, Martin notices a couple entering their home. He cases their home, stalks them, then later, Martin breaks in through their garage door. We see him sneak into their bathroom and again fill a syringe with sedative. He forces his way into the woman's room, only to find her naked with a man who isn't her husband, a fact that Martin is surprised by. What follows is an exercise in sheer, messy, ugly chaos. Martin looks at the man, who is convinced that Martin is the woman's husband, and states,
"Who are you?"
with a tone of fear in his voice. He then pounces on the couple, sinking his syringe into the man, then fleeing the room and slamming the door behind him. Martin runs back to the bathroom and frantically fills several syringes. He grips one between his teeth and exits the bathroom. To Martin's horror, the sedative has not yet set in on the man he injected, and so Martin is forced to evade him for the time being, eventually tricking him into walking out of the house so that Martin can shut the door and lock it behind him. With the man locked out, Martin again sets on the woman, syringe in hand. After a brief and awkward skirmish, Martin is able to trap the woman between two doors, nearly crushing her, and injects her with the syringe's contents. Martin grabs her, shakes her, and, like with the woman on the train, assures her that she'll just fall asleep and that he won't hurt her. Just before falling completely into unconsciousness, the woman realizes, at least partially, what Martin's intentions were, saying through tears,
You wanted me?
Yes. Yes. But I'm not going to hurt you now because of him.
What's different this time is that Martin is revealed to be telling the truth. We see him moments later feeding on the man instead. This scene is one of the most terrifying things I've ever seen in vampire fiction, and that's for a few reasons. Like I mentioned, much of the film, and particularly this scene, take on an almost documentary vibe. There are moments during this scene where it feels uncomfortably like I'm watching authentic home invasion footage. The way these physical struggles play out further negates the idea of the vampire being a symbol of total power and control. Unlike the secretly willing women of vampire fiction, hypnotized by the supernatural sexual allure of the blood drinker, Martin's victims are not so willing to submit. Martin is not naturally charismatic, and certainly not magically so. Where Dracula is an inhuman creature which can effortlessly masquerade as a human, can effortlessly ingratiate himself into human social environments, Martin is starkly portrayed as an outsider. And nowhere in the film is that made more apparent than in this scene. His forcing himself on the couple is not an act of sexy, mysterious, dominant manipulation. It is simply a horrific violation of the couple. Romero denies us the illusion of consent, and instead puts the raw violence of Martin's behavior on full display, and it is endlessly disturbing. The difference between Martin and Dracula's modes of attack are subtle but important. Dracula is an evil which weasels its way into high society, attacks people he knows, people that have begun to trust him. conversely, Martin is a home invader, a stalker, a rapist. We see Martin's otherness in the way he interacts with the couple during this attack. Immediately, when he walks in on them naked, he is intimidated, threatened by the open expression of sexuality. Their authentic intimacy is juxtaposed with the cheap imitation of it that Martin intends on engaging in with the woman. Shortly after this attack, as we watch Martin clean up the crime scene, we hear audio of him calling in to a late-night, supernatural-themed radio show, something he does a few times throughout the film. These moments act as a sort of window into Martin's thoughts, as he mainly discusses his experiences as a vampire. I'll play part of that moment here, as I think it's one of the more explicit insights we get into how Martin feels about these attacks.
I've been much too shy to ever do the sexy stuff. I mean, do it with someone who is awake. Someday maybe I'll get to do it. Awake, without the blood part. Just do it with somebody. And then be together. And talk all night.
Watching Martin clean up after himself, tuck the woman in while describing his difficulty relating to others, especially on a sexual level, is, to say the least, unnerving. This image of the voyeur standing over the object of his desire while lamenting his inability to approach it in a healthy or constructive manner is crushing and disturbing. Martin finds intimacy in the loneliest way possible, by only engaging in it with people who are sleeping. And it is that horrible contradiction that makes this sequence so gut-wrenching. It is ghostly, it is haunting, it is so very cold. So now I want to start pulling all of this together, while also touching on another important subplot in the film. And fair warning, spoilers for the film's ending are ahead. I really wanted to make this video to convince people to check this movie out, so I would really encourage seeking it out. And I don't know if this is promoting piracy or anything, but I believe due to the film's lapse in licensing, it is entirely available to watch on YouTube. So do with that as you will. In between all of the gruesome attacks and family drama, Martin has been working as a delivery boy at his cousin's grocery store. At one point, he delivers groceries to Mrs. Santini, a jaded housewife with an apparent alcohol problem, who takes an interest in Martin. She begins asking him to do odd jobs around her house while her husband is away, and the two eventually strike up something resembling a romantic relationship. And that relationship is, in a word, weird. At one point, Mrs. Santini invites Martin over to help with some job or other, and when he walks through the door, he blatantly tells her that he knows she's interested in having sex with him.
Oh, he's out of town again, and, well, he left the game room half finished.
You want me here for sex, don't you? I never really did it before. I was always too shy. But I decided I'd really like to do it with you.
And the two have sex. In a later scene, the two picnic on a hill overlooking the town. It's implied that Martin has explained his affliction to her, and she responds not with fear, but with envy.
Boy, do I wish what you have is catching.
Some people think it is catching. In the movies, it's catching.
Give it to me. Please.
And we have to stop here and think about the fact that this is all quite significant for Martin. He has found something that at least resembles the intimacy he so desires. Finally, in the film's last 10 minutes or so, a few big things happen. Martin has just attacked again, this time even more sloppily than the last. He expresses on another call to the radio show that now that he's doing it with someone who's awake, he's been having trouble going through with further attacks.
I used to be able to decide fast. I used to be able to find somebody really fast. The ladies look pretty or something.
Because of this, he's beginning to experience withdrawal and must acquire blood soon. So he finds two homeless men, incapacitates them with a blunt object, and hastily cuts into one of their arms with a piece of broken glass. This act, and its rushed, messy nature, exemplifies just how disorganized and frantic he's become. Eventually, the police arrive, and Martin flees, and several people die in the chaos. In his final call-in to the radio show, Martin tells the host that engaging in real intimacy with another person is causing him to make mistakes. He uses this moment to clear up one more misconception about vampirism.
And that's another thing about those movies. Vampires always have ladies. Sometimes lots of ladies. Well, that's wrong, too. You don't need all that.
You don't need that.
No, you really don't. I mean, if the magic part was real, and you could make them do whatever you wanted to,
Oh, yeah.
well, that would be different. In real life, you can't get people to do what you want them to do.
As the audio of the call fades out, we see Martin go to visit his lover, only to find her dead in the bathtub, apparently having committed suicide, a glass of liquor still sitting on the rim of the tub. Dracula can make people do what he wants. Dracula can elicit an intimate connection with any person he wants, and any time he wants. Dracula does not have to confront the unpredictable nature of actually, truly connecting with a human. His experience of intimacy is utterly predictable and entirely planned. Martin is endlessly thwarted by the unpredictable nature of humans. Despite the inherent strangeness of their relationship, and despite the obvious maladjustment of both parties, we nonetheless got the impression that this relationship was some sort of progress for Martin. It was a real human connection. It was real intimacy. Or at least that's what it seemed like at first. See, the way I read the portrayal of this relationship is as a sort of inversion of the standard dynamic we see between vampires and women, where we typically see the vampire opportunistically using the women he comes into contact with. In this relationship, we see the opposite. Mrs. Santini is a dissatisfied, lonesome housewife with a largely absent husband. In fact, he's never actually seen in the film. Throughout the film, we've seen Martin using unconscious women to create a cheap imitation of intimacy with. Now, in this relationship, it is her that is using Martin for a cheap imitation of human connection. And in the film's last moments, we learn that he was simply one of the last symptoms of a self-destructive downward spiral. Finally, this moment hard cuts to the final scene in the film before the credits roll. In it, Martin wakes up in his bed. Tatakuta stands over him. He accuses Martin of killing Mrs. Santini, then, without hesitation, hammers a stake into his heart. And that's it. For all his crimes, his sexual violations, his blood drinking, he is ultimately killed for a death he didn't cause. His one attempt at actual connection is his downfall. We're never told if Martin was a vampire or not. Maybe the stake through the heart killed him because he was a vampire, or maybe it just killed him because it's a stake through the heart. But whatever Martin was, he was not a traditional vampire. He was not magical or gothic or esoteric, and importantly, he could not make other people do what he wanted. Martin, unlike Dracula, is not a foil meant to highlight the sexual immorality in the characters around him. Martin is an intimate human representation of the kind of sexual immorality that those characters might fear. He is a representation of mental illness, of sexual hang-ups, of a deeply toxic kind of loneliness. Martin is the new sexual evil, one born not of women's sexual liberation, but of social alienation, of a terrifyingly carnal and insatiable desire for human connection. Thanks for watching. If you want, you can look at this last video I did. I don't know if I'm going to put it somewhere. I don't actually know how to do that, but I'm sure I could figure it out. Where I talked about Hereditary, another Halloween type deal. When do you start like celebrating and doing the whole like, oh, thank you for, this many views or whatever? Because this Hereditary video has like 650, and that's pretty cool, I think.